so hot.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is James Hadley. I'm Executive Director of Musical Theatre Network, and thank you for joining us live or catching up later on to watch this masterclass on how to pitch. We will be talking about how to pitch during a 10-minute slot for the BEAM showcase, but also how to pitch a new musical generally towards collaborators, towards producers, venue partners, investors, just in general, what the art of pitching a new musical is. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to my partner in crime. I should say that BEAM, the showcase of new musical theatre that we're talking about, is co-produced by Musical Theatre Network and also Mercury Musical Development. So I'm going to pass you over to the representative of MMD.
Hi everyone, I'm Natalia Scora. I'm the Executive Director of Mercury Musical Developments. We are a community of writers of musical theatre. Our members are composers, lyricists and book writers, and we provide a whole lot of events and opportunities to help our members develop their craft and further their careers. So before we get started, I just wanted to talk to you briefly about an event that we've got coming up on the 18th of September, and it's called Regenerate, Lost Songs from the Musicals. And this is a fundraiser for BEAM, which is happening next year. This is an online concert featuring songs by leading musical theatre writers that have never been heard before or have been cut from famous musicals. We've got wonderful songs happening in the concert by writers such as Bublé and Schönberg, Marlowe and Moss, Stephen Schwartz, Elton John and Tim Rice, and we're going to have a great lineup of talent singing those. It's an online live streamed concert on the 18th of September. It's free to watch on YouTube, as you're doing now, and you can donate during the night. But all the proceeds are going towards BEAM, and particularly towards paying the freelance creatives that are going to be in BEAM, which hopefully will be some of you watching. So please spread the word about Regenerate. Tell all your friends and family, anyone you know who likes musicals, so that we can raise as much money as possible and help BEAM be the best that it can be. If you go to beamshowcase.com and click on support BEAM, you can find out all the information and the link to the YouTube. So that's about Regenerate, but let's get on with stuff about pitching. So I'll hand back over to James.
Thank you, Natalia. Yes, so as Natalia mentioned, the BEAM Showcase website, so it's www.beamshowcase.co.uk is the website through which you can book in a pitching slot to pitch for BEAM. We have about 19 currently, might increase slightly, 19 pitching days all around the UK where you can book in a 10-minute pitching slot, and during those 10 minutes an industry panel will watch and listen, and basically from the pitching days we select the most interesting, the most provocative, the most representative, the most dynamic and most future-focused musicals in development from around the UK. BEAM as a showcase is a way of representing the new writing landscape of musical theatre, and of, in an efficient way, sharing with the industry what's going on. We all know that with new musicals, they can often be sort of underground. We all know there's years and years of development for many new musicals. So one of the things that BEAM responds to is an opportunity for people to discover what's bubbling through, what people are developing in terms of new musical theatre, and to see it often in its earlier stages before it goes through years and years of workshops, so that people have a chance to get on board. We've been told when we were first developing BEAM2016, the first of the showcases, that producers and development partners, they want to see work in its early stages rather than wait until it's a finished sort of draft 10 or whatever of a new musical. When all the decisions have been made, people like to come on board often in the earlier development stages. So BEAM was a way of often showing musicals in early stages. Sometimes they are fully written, fully finished musicals, but the majority of musicals being pitched to us are early drafts, early stages of a new musical. In fact, in some cases, it is just a concept and a few songs that people have and that they're sharing at that point. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our lovely panelists to introduce themselves and tell us just a little bit about their experience of either pitching or being pitched to. First up, I'm going to hand over to the lovely Samir Bamra from Physical.
Hello, everyone. I'm, as James said, the artistic director of Physical, and I've had the privilege of both pitching as well as being on the panel for BEAM. Now, in terms of how I prepared for the pitch, I basically started with who am I, what am I making, what is the show I'm making, who is it for, Where am I at the development of it? It's basically the who, what, why, when, where. You know, when is it happening? Where is it happening, etc. And I sort of condensed my speech into that. Tried to use language that was going to be exciting in my explanation of it, and then most importantly was present a showcase of what it was about, so that the panelists could witness some of the joy of the craft, the music, hear the music, see the music, and it was pretty intense because when I was on that journey, I was thinking, I've got this whole 120-minute musical. How am I going to condense it down to like a 10-minute pitch and explain everything that is magical about my show? And you somehow just have to work at it, and just get it right. Now, from the other perspective, as the panelist viewing, I was just literally amazed with the amount of work that people do go through. You know, they really do focus on knowing what their message is about the show, and making sure that they've picked the right song and directed it in the best way possible. You know, some people had directed like with an entire ensemble of voices and singing and dancing, whereas others were a sole man presenting everything. And I think my best one to date, still the most memorable pitch that I've ever heard, was a sole man on his piano. Simple as it is.
Simple is good. Thank you, Samir. Thank you so much. And now over to Steph.
Hello, I'm Steph Weller. I'm an independent producer. I produce through my production company, Playwell Productions. I have had 2 pitches in BEAM, both of which would have been in 2020, bumped to 2021. Black Power Desk, which was looking at the different scales Samir was just talking about, was quite a large pitch. We had about six or seven performers. We showcased a medley of 5 songs. And then when we got through to the Hackney last year, we were fortunate enough to do a 20-minute version of that. We also pitched Lesbian Pirates, which is a show, disabled-led creative show. And we had a mix of singers and deaf performers and signers with ours. And we did that as a digital spotlight last year. The scale of both pitches were quite different, partly for practical reasons and partly because we wanted to showcase different aspects of the different shows. One of the things that I would advise is really spend time on that 10 minutes. It's very easy to think you can throw in a couple of songs and then add some blurb, but actually I think it's worth crafting those 10 minutes really carefully. I timed everything to within an inch of its life because I'm a producer and that's what I do. But we also made sure that during those 10 minutes, we looked at the panel as if they were our audience that we were aiming for. So we made sure it was the most engaging 10 minutes we could come up with. We made sure we got the key information that we'll go into in more detail later, I'm sure, about the journey we've been on and where we're heading, etc. But though timing everything to within an inch of its life meant that we went in really confident that we weren't going to get buzzed out at a crucial point of our pitch. So it's boring, but it's definitely worth putting in that legwork.
Top tip there. Thank you, Steph. Over to Zara.
Hello, everyone. I'm Zara, and I'm a composer, lyricist, and writer. I was actually in BEAM in 2016 and in the last one in Hackney. And my experiences were quite different because the pitch that I did that got into 2016 I think doesn't exist anymore, which was something called a composer spotlight. I was one of a few people that was basically, which I think is going to be relevant for those, particularly like the young people that might be coming to pitch that might feel like they haven't got anything to show or like are wondering whether they've got enough stuff to sort of take a chance on it. The composer spotlight at the time was about you as a writer, so I just had to sort of go and pitch me in that context for that year, and that meant that when it came to my showcase, that I could sort of do what I wanted, and I chose to do 2 sort of contrasting things, one that was already existing and then one that I wrote to fill what little time I had left. And Steph's point's really a really good one, because I always go for the tight 8 minutes, like door to door, like, because I know it comes in all of the blurb and it says don't make more than 8 minutes, but really don't make more than 8 minutes, because then you just feel a bit more. I mean, it's quite a stressful thing to do, of course it is, but you just feel a bit calmer in the fact that, like Steph says, you're not going to get buzzed out and stuff. So I would always, I'd take 7.5 minutes over sort of like 9 minutes 20 any day of the week. So I sort of wrote a song. So I think that left me with something like 2 minutes 40 seconds to write a whole second song, but I managed to get it to work. And so that was that experience. So yeah, that pitch was more about sort of talking about work in general, which may be relevant for what some of you might be doing. And then I sort of played a bit of a song that wasn't something that I was going to do in the pitch, but it actually was relevant because it just showed sort of my songwriting in a sort of small example, which was very useful. In 2018, a slightly different thing. I did have a show to pitch. So my show's called In These Walls, but again, which might also be relevant, there wasn't much of it to pitch, to be fair. I had a couple of songs and I had the concept, and that was kind of it really. And so planning the pitch for that day, I think it's really important to sort of say, there's a distinction between what you have to take into the pitch for the pitching day and what you can do at the showcase. So it's a good thing to remember that you don't have to get bogged down in thinking, is this thing that I do on this day the thing that I have to do at the theatre? Because it isn't, and that's a really good thing, because you can sort of tailor those two things separately. So in my pitch for this last year, there was a little bit more talking and one whole song, and that was kind of what I felt was right for that show. So there were two really, really different experiences, but in terms of what those pitches are, I think it's quite an interesting sort of comparison to make. That's sort of that's it for now. You need to
unmute myself. There we go. And now over to Matt. Thank you, Zara. Over to Matt.
Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Eames. I'm head of theatres at the Lowry, specialising in contemporary and commissioning new work. But my background was as a performer and director of commercial musical theatre, which I did for 12 years before kind of crossing to venue management and being on the other side. I'm pitched to all day. I mean, practically speaking, as a venue, the Lowry does, in some senses, support new work to happen. And we could talk about that a little bit, especially in terms of pitching. But really, we are pitched, 10 to 30 projects a day, whether it's via email, telephone, or in meeting form. To normally at the later stage of development to put on our stages as a receiving or as a presenting venue, and they are everything from small scale to medium scale to large scale. So there are common themes definitely between what happens and what stage the project is, but ultimately for me, it is the project, and if you are sharing the piece or some of the piece, then it's how I feel that is going to, how audiences are going to relate immediately to that work, and in my case, how Lowry audiences are going to relate to that work, but it's also the people. And I suppose there's a common link to, especially to those who've been performers who are or have been on another side of the industry, is just who are you? And I want to know about you as much as I do about your work. So it's being relaxed, being yourself as much as you can in those crazy circumstances. So the people, the project, and the quality of the work. I think for us, we do have a specific rewrites festival, a festival for new musical theatre that is a platform for musicals in development. So I'll always be looking for projects that fit in with that. And again, they can be very early stages going into a curtain raiser, or they can be full productions of work. And then productions and companies that have been through that in the past are companies like The Letter Room, Spit Lip with Operation Mincemeat, who first scratched that show as part of rewrites, Leo and Hyde, Fat Rascals. So all of whom we've had presence at BEAM, I think, over the years. So you know, I've been successfully pitched to quite a lot, including by Steph and Samir, and I very much remember Zara's songs in the very first BEAM festival. So yeah, I'm sure we'll go into the specifics of how to structure your pitch now. But yeah, that's my £2 to begin.
Thank you so much. More like £2. That was very, very valuable information there. Thank you, Matt. Yes, just about the format of this evening. So as you probably have got the gist, we're going to talk to our panelists about the content of a 10-minute pitch to begin with tonight, and talk about a few of the details to further expand on some of those introductions, talking about the details of the content of a pitch and some of let's give some top tips basically about how best to use a 10-minute pitch, just as a way of talking about approaches to pitching your work generally. I mean, many of the time we think of pitching only in relation to a producer or a venue, but of course, when you're talking to a potential co-writer or a collaborator or a performer, that's also a pitch, isn't it? You're asking someone to invest their time and energies into a project. So this is all about how to engage people with your work, really, in different contexts, as much as how to sell your work. It's how to engage. And as several of our panelists have said in their introductions, it's very much about what's the content from your show that will engage an audience, that will engage someone emotionally in the details. So we're going to talk for about another 15 minutes or so, generally, with our panelists, and then we will be opening up the conversation to everyone watching in the live stream to ask questions of our panelists. If at any point while we're talking initially or later on you have a question, just write it into the live chat feed in YouTube, prefaced with the word question in capital letters, and then we will be able to ask our panelists those questions. So do write those questions at any point during the event that you'd like to ask of our panelists. So before we go over to general questions, just to tease out some of your answers, our lovely panelists, in terms of, we've already said there were some good points made there about length, in terms of, you know, for BEAM, as has been referenced, we give each person pitching 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes, for most people, if there are access mobility issues, we will start the pitch once you're set up and ready. But generally, particularly if there's more than one person pitching, the 10 minutes start as soon as you're in that space with the industry panel experiencing your pitch. And so the 10 minutes would ideally include any kind of setup time. So it's always good if there's more than one person pitching, for the first person to start speaking as soon as they are in the room ready to go. And if someone needs to set up some instruments, they do that in the background of someone starting to speak and talk to us. Because for BEAM, we usually get around 300 pitches. So it's a lot of pitches to work our way through. We have to use the time in those pitching days efficiently, in the same way as anyone individually within a pitch wants to use those 10 minutes efficiently. And that's why Zara and Steph were both referring to using the 10 minutes efficiently, thinking of it almost as 8 minutes rather than 10 minutes. And then you've got a little bit of expansion time for questions and so on at the end. So ideally think of it being a little bit less than 10 minutes. So you have a good tight 8 minutes, and that can expand to 10 with the sort of the natural organic nature of these things. But first general question to our panelists is, within those 10 minutes, what would you say the ideal balance is in terms of the information that someone would be sharing with potential development staging partners? What sort of, how much, what would you say the balance is between speaking and talking about the content and actually sharing some songs from the show? What ideally would you say is the balance to get you interested from those 10 minutes? Who would like to start on that? Shall I hand over to Matt, first of all?
Okay, I don't mind saying, I think as even as you can make it, understanding that you may not have lots of material to share yet for this project, but you know, I think share, yeah, ultimately it's what you said, James, it is balance that you're trying to achieve. So good content, but not too much, good material, but not too much, good info, but not too much, and just so that there is no sense of rush, you know. And I just emphasize again what Steph said about practice, because that will ensure that you aren't trying to rush, because if you are really packing it through, then we will, you know, I sort of feel that tension as a panel member. I'm sort of, you know, slightly on edge myself. So it's yeah, it is a balance that you're trying to receive and a nice flow to the pitch. But you know, we certainly want to hear something. We definitely want to hear the work, and if not the work, then examples of your work, I guess. I can't remember the specific criteria for this, James, but I think if that's, you know, if that gives a sense of the work, then that's good for us as well.
Exactly. Just to clarify that, yes, we always say, if at all possible, please do share at least one song, ideally 2 songs in a BEAM pitch. If you're a book writer and all that exists is the book and the concept, then that's fine to talk about the book and perhaps share a brief excerpt from the book if you don't have any songs. But if at all possible, really try and include a song, or even just the lyrics. If you have lyrics but they're not set to music yet, share the lyrics. It's so hard to compare a show that pitches with songs to a show that pitches and there are no songs yet written. So by sharing songs, you stand a much better chance of creating an engagement and of people getting really excited about the show. But over to our panelists again, further thoughts on the balance of content to be shared.
I mean, I also think, yeah, sorry, I also think it's sort of about what you have yourself. So it's sort of about looking at your material and going, I think there are lots of factors. This is how I would think about it anyway. It's like, what are you most comfortable with doing in the room? Because you might not want to say anything, so then you might want to make that, you might not be comfortable speaking, or you might find that quite anxiety making, so you might want to tighten that bit up. You might want to make that shorter and then share a bit more music. And is someone going to come and sing for you? Big shout out to Jack Reitman, who's sang my pitch for this last BEAM. For me at the time, I basically had a song and a prologue, which is what I ended up showing in the showcase, but I didn't want to take both of those into my BEAM pitch because that would have left me very little time, like a minute, to talk about the nuts and bolts of what I thought the show could do. And so I focused a bit more time on talking about, you know, like ensemble size, band size, you know, sort of space that I thought it might go in, and then a sort of brief rundown of what the story was. In addition to that, I sort of took a bit of a punt on the thinking, well, for me, my songs can be quite long. So the song that I had was sort of like over 5 minutes, 5.5 minutes, I think it was. And I just thought I could do a segment of that and a segment of the other one and chat a bit more. But actually, for me to get the most impact out of what I thought the feel of the show would be in general, I made a decision to go, well, we have to do the whole thing start to finish. So then that was 5.5 minutes, just left me sort of 2.5 to sort of do that bit of talking. And I think that was kind of a good gamble. When it came to the showcase, I did put the other bit of music in, which left me with about 55 seconds to speak, but that was fine because we were able to like do a musical segue, and you're sort of playing to a different crowd once you're there, so you don't need to sort of worry about that, and you can have those conversations in the pub as well. Like there's lots of like outside time to have those. You don't have that when you're pitching to get in, I suppose, is my point. So yeah.
Thank you, Zara. Steph?
Yeah, I think as Zara rightly puts it, it all depends on what you've got to begin with. I guess all I can do is really talk about it from a producing perspective. I think for me, I'd probably almost see it in maybe in thirds. Maybe that's not quite true, but I definitely want to get some of the kind of the narrative in, so people know what journey their audience will be taken on. I would always want to do the classic producer thing about giving any programmers or partners a sense of the scale of the show, as Zara said. So size of the show, who's involved, and also the legacy so far. So who may or may not, or who may have funded it, not who may not have funded it. We don't talk about that. Who's been involved so far and where you want it to go. So I probably do story stuff, excite them about that and the characters, practical pitching stuff. And then third, probably for me, more towards a half, so those figures don't stack up on the music itself. As I think I touched on, I think when you've got a lot of material, if you're in that fortunate position, And you can use that to take the audience on the journey. It's worth putting in the prep to see if, instead of playing one whole song, if you've got plenty to choose from, you might want to think about crafting something along the lines of maybe something like a medley, or something that gives a sense of maybe an arc. So for Black Power Desk, we particularly focused on, partly because that's all we'd written, that first act building up to the kind of climax of Act 1, and we tried to use those sort of snippets of 5 songs to take the pitching panel on that sort of journey. With Lesbian Pirates, we cut down and we used 3 songs, because what we wanted to showcase was the sort of Natasha the writer's sort of diversity of writing, and we also wanted to make it very clear how we were embedding the deaf performers and the BSL within that. So again, we sort of thought about what was important for us to convey in terms of the direction of the show musically, and slightly in terms of staging, I guess, for us. But also we were in a position to do that because we had more material. Obviously, if you've only got 1 song, as Zara says, just play your fantastic 1 song, make it as good as you can, and really get into the weeds of what you want and where you've come from and where you want to be going. So that's probably the way I tend to approach it.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And just to clarify, in both those cases, with those specific examples, with Zara's show, In These Walls, having a whole song really allowed us to really get under the skin of the character and the emotional moment they were in. So we were really there in that emotional moment of the show. And it really, I think that's what a key thing is. You're trying to get under the skin of the panelists to make them feel something. You want to get past the surface. And if you engage someone internally with their emotions, then you're in, basically, you're inside. And that's what we all want, isn't it? We want to get inside people, inside their minds, inside their hearts. So I think that's a key way of thinking about the impact. And similarly, as Steph was talking about the music from Black Power Desk, because there was such a rich blend of different styles of music used within that show, having the range of different songs being shared, it got us really excited about the eclecticism of the score, the scope of the show, because it's a big show in terms of its stylistic content. So again, it's really thinking what's going to serve your show. Sorry, back over to Samir. I haven't given you a chance to respond yet. So the question, I think you were possibly out of the call, was the what you would say the ideal balances between sung content and spoken content within the pitch.
I mean, I think all 3 of you have actually nailed the answer. For me, when I pitched Bombay Superstar, which is basically a musical that has almost no English songs at all, or English language songs, because it was a jukebox musical set to Bollywood music, which is entirely in Hindi. I wanted to give a flavor of the various songs that showcased that era and that time period. But most importantly for me, it was why did I want to tell this story, and my emotional reason for why it was an important story to tell, and how it would connect emotionally again with the audiences. That for me was like, I wanted the panel to feel empathetic towards the characters. And once you build that, you've also built that then with the audience at the end of the day. So you really have to figure out a way of what is the best thing or the worst thing about your character that you want to showcase. We pitched with a band, the most strangest band ever, which is primarily of students who are doctors, trained to be doctors, engineers, lawyers, and these were young people who love Bollywood. And for me, it was also about showing the relevance of why a language that isn't necessarily spoken by all South Asians in the country or globally was still very relevant to all South Asians of different ages. So even though it was a show set in the 70s, it was still very relevant to a younger audience today, to evoke nostalgia for their parents, but completely about relevance to them. So I think that everyone here has pretty much answered that question. In terms of timings, I did 6 minutes of song, and because I hate speaking, 2 minutes of dialogue, and I stuck to 8 minutes.
Amazing. We're so impressed when it's all so slickly timed. It really shows. Steph brought up a really good point before about, I'm amazed when I'm sitting on a panel how many times people forget to say the basic information of the size of the cast and size of the band. If you know it, those are really essential things. And again, the stage of development, it's really useful to know Is it just the first couple of songs that exist? Is it a full first draft? Is it the first act that's been written at this point? Have you been working on it for 10 years or for 2 months? It's really useful to share that kind of information. Next question to the panel is elevator pitch. What is an elevator pitch? And do you think they're still useful in the context of a wider 10-minute pitch? Who wants to say what an elevator pitch is? Does anyone actually use the elevator pitch?
I have to confess, I am really, this is awful. No one is ever going to want to work with me again. I really struggle with an elevator pitch. I struggle, and I know that's awful. And I can talk about my projects, and I can talk about the wonderful people I work with, but to condense it down is a real challenge, and I have to really work at it. I think it's always useful, if not even in the pitch. It's useful if you're thinking ahead to, say, the showcase itself. If you get in, it's useful for the conversations in the bar afterwards, if nothing else. So it's basically, can you sell it in, there's like a model, isn't there? Sell it in, I don't know, 2 sentences or 1 sentence or 20 words or less. But basically get to the heart of your show as quickly as possible. That's how I think of it. Matt will probably have far more elegant way of putting it than me.
No, I think you nailed it, Steph. I don't think there's any glamorous way of putting it. I think it is, a way of reducing the content and the substance and the essence of the work down to the most easily translatable few words. And yeah, there is definitely the models of 10, 20 words, particularly when it's in the written form. I think being able to say it within a minute, let's say 30 to 60 seconds, being able to explain, get to the heart of your show. Is it useful? I think it's useful if your work can be explained like that. Yeah, I think it's okay if it can't, or if, you know, that only tells part of the story. But there's no doubt that if you have a really clever conceit for your show that is immediately understandable, I think to an extent, this comes to mind obviously because Steph's right in front of me, but you know, Lesbian Pirates had a very direct message, and I think in my feedback, whenever I've given, you know, Steph and I talked about it, there is, you know, a historical context that's very easy to give over. There is, you know, a style of work that you can talk about, and there's a good kind of meat to that immediately a programmer and a producer and therefore an audience can immediately grasp. So if you have that, then it's certainly of value. If your work is much more, you know, not that isn't textured, but if it's not a simple narrative story or a narrative story that can immediately engage its audience, then it's okay not to focus on that, not to run your pitch like that. So definitely useful to have an essence of your work. If it's not the entirety of your work, then that's cool too.
Like I've said earlier, I think I sort of forced myself into one by accident in the showcase, just by the fact that I had about 7 minutes of music in there, which is not what I did in my pitch at the theatre. So I think I wouldn't choose to do it like just as that being my first port of call, but it's good if you can, you know, if you can sell the bit of information you want to sell in multiple ways, and if that happens to be a necessity for what you need it for, then it's useful to be able to do it. But yeah, like Matt says, I don't think, you know, it doesn't always work if you've got a more complex concept to deliver or explain. Then, you know, take the time, but just be mindful of the time. But you can say quite a lot in a minute, I think, as long as you're not, you know, if you manage to sort of calm your heart rate down and not rush through it, you can still get quite a lot of information over. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's cool. I think it sounds good.
That's all really helpful. Thank you for that context. And just for those who haven't heard the term elevator pitch before, it comes from the idea of if you're traveling in an elevator, because of course we're talking Broadway, as so many musical theatre references do, you're in an elevator traveling between floors and a big producer steps into the lift with you, and you've just got a few floors journey to sell the idea for whatever your book, your show, your musical in our case. And so if you've only got that journey in an elevator, is all the time you have to share your ideas pitches. That's where the term comes from. One thing I'd also say that we've experienced is something that often comes up in an elevator pitch but is relevant to a wider pitch, is where people say, and I think this comes from film pitching more, is where you say it's like Cats meets Next to Normal meets Hamilton. I mean, that would be a very weird mashup, but where there are cultural reference points, and they may well not be musical theatre, often it's more relevant to people to say it's like Taylor Swift meets, I don't know, The Wanted meets, I don't know, ABBA. You know, it's reference points that might, well, whatever that is within your world or the world of your characters, what are some cultural reference points to sort of say, this is kind of the influences that are coming together to create something new and unique within this show. If that's useful, then include it, but if it's not, just forget about it. Another question is that we often get about pitching is people saying, so I'm a writer of a musical, I can sing my own songs, but not very well. Should I be the one performing my songs, or should I be getting someone else to come in and perform my songs for me while I talk about the show? How important is the beautiful playing of a song within a pitch? Does it matter if I'm not a brilliant performer and I perform my own work? What would you all say, panelists?
Well, I can't sing to save my life, so there is no way I am going to be singing. I will always make sure that there is someone in my present pitches to be able to sing, and ideally sing beautifully. If I could sing badly, as in mediocrely, would I do it? I probably still wouldn't, because I think that there is something about the objectivity about listening to someone singing the song as well for you. Because I'm also a writer and a director, so I like to listen back to my songs. So that for me is quite important. But yeah, I wouldn't do it personally.
I think it's good to have another, like Samir said, really, it's just good to have another voice in the room. And you know, I'll often play for pitches, but ask other people to sing if it's relevant. I mean, I didn't have a choice because the song that I was thinking needs to be sung by a man, so that was decided for me on that one. But I probably would always anyway. And also then, you know, you've got a lot to think about with sort of structuring the pitch and making sure it's sort of like running on time and all that kind of thing. So if you can alleviate some of the performance stress, because you know, even if you're really confident performer, you'll still feel, you know, there's still lots of, you know, nerves on the day and all that kind of thing, and you might be throwing curveballs of, you know, anything can happen. So you want to sort of kind of limit anything that might sort of put more pressure on you. So if you've got a brilliant singer that's happy to sort of, you know, learn some material and you can work through it with them, and then all you're focusing on is the structure and what you're going to say and sort of how the whole thing's going to fit together. I just think there's a lot of value in that, and you know, we all want to feel calmer. I just think anything that can make that happen is a good thing, really.
I guess I completely agree with all of that, but I think the exceptions are where you make your musicals in different ways. So you know, if we think of Spit Lip and Letter Room and Fat Rascal to some extent too, they are making that show themselves. They're creating the work together. They perform that work. You know, the essence of what they do is them performing. So yeah, that's cool too. You don't need to, if you are what makes that, you know, it's not just the material you make, it's the fact that you're making it. Sheep Soup, of course, would be another great example of that. You know, there's certainly an argument to say that they are definitely the best makers of that work, in the same way that Mischief, you know, in terms of fast-paced kind of comedy, you know, when they're not doing it, you know, is it quite the same? Would it still be the same? So I think if it's very much your work and it has to be done that way, then yeah, then that's fine too. But yeah, where you can, I do agree with the other panelists, where you can have that distance and you're a writer or you're a composer, then yeah, always best to let someone else interpret your work.
And I guess just to jump in, I think I would always, where possible, use other people as the producer. I'd always encourage it. But I just wanted to acknowledge that, as we all on this panel know, not everybody is in a position to invite other people into that space. It could be because they don't have the networks yet. It could be because they can't afford to pay someone. And obviously we always work hard to pay anybody that comes in to work on our material with us, even if it's only for a day. So it's heartening to hear Matt obviously say that if you can't, then don't, and it's okay, because I think if your material's strong, then I think that will shine through regardless of if you're a little bit off key or you're not the best singer in the world, or you're playing it on guitar because you can't get a whole band together and your guitar might be a bit rusty. Your passion for your project will shine through, and that is the benefit of you delivering your own material, is that you know it best and you can bring that sort of intention to it. So don't be put off if you don't feel that you can bring other people into that space.
Yes, 100% echoing that. The panelists are industry specialists who are going to be looking at the material and able to see past. It's like when you're listening to a recording of a song, everyone learns how to tell what's a recording that's got lots of polish on it and it might be actually hiding some flaws in the songwriting, versus a really rough demo, but you can sense that actually the songwriting is really, really special. And after listening to a few demos, you get that sense of what makes a great song. It's the same thing with experiencing pitch after pitch during a pitching day, is it really does come across where the writing is really amazing. What's being judged is not the quality of the performance, but the quality of the writing, the content that is being shared. So absolutely, people will look past the performance specifics. I think we're at that stage of the event where we're going to, Samir's got a point, and then we're going to open up to questions from the floor, and Natalia is going to share some of those, but over to Samir briefly first.
I just had a thought that because, we all have different ways of how we listen, absorb, access work. I think one of the things that people could do is if you feel that you aren't a strong enough performer, is also to print out the songs and give it to us so that while you're singing, we're reading it as well. So we're following that story. So in case a word doesn't get pronounced properly, or we go, what was that? We've got that to read. I mean, I personally love reading as well as listening, because it just helps me focus in a particular way. So that's if there is ways to do that, I'd suggest doing that.
And just to clarify, as a general rule, we say please don't send printouts at the pitches, but with lyric sheets, you can hand out lyric sheets to the panelists to read while you're doing the pitch, but please take them away with you afterwards and hopefully reuse them so it's nice and green. Over to Natalia.
Yes, well, actually, the first question I was going to ask is on that very subject of handouts, as two people have asked questions about that. Emma and Alice have asked about should they bring any kind of handouts, or would you prefer to just experience the verbal pitch and the music? And if handouts, then what kind of information should be on there? Artwork, logo designs, press releases, lyrics, etc. So James, do you want to just clarify that point again? And then maybe Matt could say in a non-BEAM context, what kind of printed material might be useful?
Amazing, thank you. Yes, sorry, I didn't realize that question's coming on. I would have left it to be the panelist response. But yeah, on our BEAM website, there is a big frequently asked questions section that answers a lot of general questions that we get every time we do BEAM pitching days. And I think one of them is asking about, can I share handouts? And because the panelists see maybe 20 pitches during a day, and we're trying to be environmentally sustainable, we do say, because if we say, yes, bring handouts, everyone will feel they have to write a document, and you'll be facing a table of people looking through documents instead of looking at you. We want the panelists to get everything they need to get from looking at you and watching your pitch. So we tend to say, please include all the information within the live pitch rather than in a document. The one exception, as we were saying, is if you want to share a lyric sheet, as Samir was suggesting, that's absolutely allowed to share that lyric sheet so that the panelists can follow the lyrics, particularly for some types of songs like I know a lot of rap-based songs, it can be super helpful for those who maybe are not listening to rap all the time to be able to follow the lyrics of the rap live. If it's a really fast rap, that can be super helpful. Or if it's a song in a language other than English, and generally most of the panelists are English speaking, so it's a great idea if you want to share a translation of the song. We did have one show pitched to us entirely in the Welsh language during the last pitching days, so even the speaking around the songs was in Welsh, and it was really helpful to those of us who aren't fluent in Welsh to have a translation of the full pitch shared as a document. So yes, for translation reasons, we'd absolutely encourage that as well. But over to Matt to talk about documents and in general. I know a question we specifically get, if you're happy to answer this, Matt, is people asking, can they send a script of a show, whether people at a venue want to be sent scripts from shows or not? Okay, yeah, quickly, in a BEAM context, I'd agree. We don't, you know, unless it's for a specific reason like a lyric sheet, I think we'd rather be looking and engaging with you, and you know, I'm sure any directors and performers would be feeling the same. You know, you want that kind of, as uncomfortable as it might be sometimes, you do want that kind of personal connection. In terms of wider pitching, yeah, I mean, a pack, a marketing pack, a promo pack is a kind of standard way of engaging, even if it's a venue, whether it's in person or on the phone or through an email, normally through an email first. And I would say you don't need to send all of that information in the first context. I think keeping your email as concise as possible in terms of what your pitch is and who you are and what you're pitching is great. I think once it is getting to that point where hopefully the theatre or the venue wants to know a bit more about the project, then it's got to work for that venue. So I work in a venue where we probably 90% of the time, 80% of the time, we are taking proposals in for work that is on the verge of being made, or you know, is show ready, is audience ready. So an idea of how audiences will meet that work. There's not going to be show pictures, probably, you know. So it's what else can you bring? You know, it's how will it feel like as an immediate impression to the audience. So some sort of, it could be a title treatment, or it could be just a flavour in image form of how it's going to look and feel. That is very, very useful. And yeah, the kind of the 20 or 50 word copy, the blurb of what an audience might expect. That's as good for I say this every time I realise, but you know, that's as good from a programmer. Ultimately, a programmer is a filter for an audience. So if we get it, the audience will get it. We'll be confident that they'll get it. They'll come and see your show. You know, that sort of directness of information. I think scripts, and with that information, any technical information you have, yes, number of cast, whether you are able to offer accessible performance in any way, certainly understanding the full picture of your company is really important. We want to know why you make the work. Doesn't need to be really long, but that's really good to know. Scripts, I think are good if the venue asks for it, and if they don't, then I probably wouldn't. It would be my suggestion. So if it can be an offer, I think by all means, but unless they're actively taking scripts and have the people, and there are precious few, I'm afraid, of those that are interested in taking a script and working with you on it, precious few, even amongst the producing venues that remain. Unsolicited scripts are probably are not the best way to engage with venues, I'm afraid. But I certainly, if I'm interested, for particularly for rewrites purposes, there's probably a mix of some that I will receive a script for and read through it where I've asked for it, or whether it's been offered and I've accepted, and then others that's actually never part of the conversation. You know, it's not that I have a good understanding of what it is and what the offer is for audiences, or as part of the development of the work, and that's good enough for me.
Great, thanks, Matt. Next question, we have another one that a couple of people have asked, is about preferences for live versus recorded music in a pitch, and also any thoughts about presenting some material on film during a pitch. Anyone like to start us off with that one? Zara, any thoughts on live versus recorded music?
I would normally say live. If you have the ability to do it, because I just don't think there's anything like it, and it's kind of why we love musicals, right? That's like the whole point, is that sort of nothing can quite make your skin bristle in a way as somebody singing something belting in a room in front of your face. Like that's, I think, is the but it's not always possible. So it's not always possible for people to be able to do that. Like Steph was saying, if you don't have those resources, or you just can't get that stuff together. When I did my pitch in 2016, I didn't have anything to perform live in the room, and I did play a bit of a recording of something. It wasn't something that I'd sung, but it was something that somebody had recorded for me, so I was able to do that. So it is something that, and I've seen pitches where people have done video pitches and all those kinds of things, and it might be relevant to the kind of show you have. I think we had one in 2016 that was part sort of like animation and film and part live, like as an actual complete thing. So then it's wholly relevant to the piece that you're presenting. So, but if it's kind of, the bulk of musical theatre is kind of, live stuff being sung at you, then if you can do that, I'd always say try and do that if you can.
Yeah, great. Does anyone want to join? Yeah, jump in on that, Matt?
I go, Steph. You're gonna.
No. My point was just, if you are doing that, it's very boring. If you are doing that, just leave extra time in your script for tech fails and just dealing with that. That's all I was going to say. Over to you, Matt.
Well, yeah, I was going to add to that, to just be fairly definitive if it's helpful, and please feel free to disagree. Don't show us a film, and mostly because it will fuck up. So don't do it. I don't think the wins could ever be big enough for you to take that risk, I'm afraid. But I suppose live and recorded could include where you have a backing track, but there is a live singing, and I guess that's fine. But again, as Steph said, be aware that could fail. So yeah, build in extra time.
Great, thanks, Matt. Very straightforward answer. A question for Samir. At the beginning in your intro, you mentioned that one of the best pitches that you saw was just a soul man on a piano. And could you talk to us a little bit more about why that pitch was so special? If Samir's there.
I think Samir had to step out for a moment. So should I just quickly respond to that?
Yes, please.
And anyone jump in if you like. I think that what Samir was probably responding to is one of the strongest, I shouldn't say this, but it's happened now, BEAM 2021 at Hackney Empire, one of the most talked about pitches was Luke Sadin pitching the Naughty Carriage on the Orphan Train. And that was one man at piano. It might have been the one that Samir's talking about. And it was just because it was a writer singing from the heart. It was very much an emotional connection between a writer saying, this is my vision. He was really passionate about the vision for his show. He really cared about getting this show to an audience, and he managed to share both in what he was saying and in what he was playing to make a really strong emotional connection. And I think that's why it really connected. I'm guessing what Samir might have said, but yeah, that was that example.
Cool. Thanks, James. Okay, next question we have from Lauren. After a pitch, do the pitchees tend to ask further questions? I'm assuming by pitchees, she's meaning panelists. And if so, is there anything extra we can do to prepare for these? Steph, have you found in a pitch that the panelists have asked extra questions, or is the time always too tight?
I don't think so. I mean, I feel like I've obviously traumatized for my pitching days. No. I think we probably at the end of both of ours allowed for that and said, if you've got any questions, or we provided some information about how they could get hold of us. I don't think we factored it in particularly. Maybe we left 30 seconds or something at the end. I don't know, do people ask questions? Matt, I'm going to come to you because you've been on the panel loads.
Certainly don't worry if the panel don't ask questions, I would say. One other point I was going to come to, and maybe this is the moment for it, is just about self-awareness. So it's be really hyper-aware without drawing attention to problems. But if there is an obvious question to ask about the piece, I know, you know, James mentioned about rights, for example, that question will be asked. If it's not immediately made apparent. If you have not thought about diversity in your project, you will get asked something about that. So, you know, especially if you are telling a story that, you know, that is perhaps arguably someone else's to tell, then, you know, you should expect to be challenged on that, and you should be prepared to have a good answer. So those, I think it's being really aware of your project and where it fits in, and that will help you prepare for any questions that come up.
And that's a really good point, I guess, in terms of your prep, isn't it? Because you probably know the questions you might get asked because you know the gaps. So maybe try and plug those gaps before you get there, and then jobs are good, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And James, anything else to add on with your experiences of being at so many pitches? Is there usually a time for any questions, or is it
Precious
just if there's something really urgent that needs to be asked?
Exactly, precious little. Like I said, the most frequent question is just very quickly, can you just clarify the number of cast members? Or it's those little factual things that people might have missed out in the presentation or stage of development, or as you say, if it's checking about the rights. We always say that you have to have the intellectual ownership of everything that you pitch to BEAM. We don't want to look at work where you're thinking of applying for the rights to adapt something that would make it ineligible. Yeah, it's usually very, very brief questions because we have a 5-minute turnaround between one 10-minute pitch and the next. And if we run over, it means everyone else for the rest of that day is going to be waiting to do their pitches. So we usually try and keep questions to an absolute minimum at the end of the presentation. So as everyone said, include as much of the information as you can within the content of your 10 minutes.
Great. Next question is from Joe. If you're bringing in a singer to represent the music, how important is it for them to represent or look like the character they are portraying? So I guess that's about the casting of your pitch.
I can take this one.
Right.
Lovely Jack Reitman, who came to sing my pitch, was not the right casting, and he knew that. We talked about it before we went in, but he luckily he was available to step in and did an amazing job. But it doesn't matter. It absolutely doesn't matter in the BEAM pitch. And interestingly, then when it came to the showcase, I did cast it with somebody who was the right casting for it, because that's a different, like I said earlier, it's a different audience then. So you want to try and do that for if you're fortunate to get into the showcase, you want to try and do that then. But because what you're selling in, not selling, but what you're presenting in the first pitch is sort of like this whole thing, and you're trying to give a sense of the music. At that point, it doesn't matter who's doing it. It's just that there's something to hear, and that you've tied that into what you have to say about your show, and it's all kind of a cohesive whole. I think that's more important. So yeah, I'd say it was part of it.
Great, thanks. Does everyone agree? Any other opinions on that? No? Great. So the perfect casting is not super important at this stage. Next question, interesting one. Any thoughts on diegetic pitches, i.e. people in character from the show pitching? This is from Tilly. Has anyone ever come across a pitch like that? Yes, James?
Well, just to clarify, we don't expect you to spend money on your pitch. We'd encourage people to do all the preparation, but not to invest money in rehearsals, or do it as little as possible, because we recognize everyone, it's, you know, cost of living crisis, etc. Who has the extra cash? And very, very occasionally, people have gone to the extent of putting an actor in a costume, and we actively advise against that, because the people on a panel are there because they know the industry, they're very experienced, they have great imaginations. And if you say, imagine this person is dressed like an 18th century maid. Immediately you've got that. We don't need to see any props. We don't need to see any costumes. It should just be pure theatre. It should just be yourself and a keyboard, or a performer wearing the clothes they happen to put on that day. You don't need to wear blacks or anything like that. It's very informal, very friendly. So no production elements at all whatsoever, please.
Anyone want to add on to that about pitching in character?
I think that I don't know whether they ever did this, but I could totally imagine Sheep Soup, for example, doing something like that, because that's where their characters that live and come from. They are, you know, they are everyday people in everyday kind of situations. So I think if it really suits it and you can pull it off and do it, but be aware of the risk. There's a definite risk there that it might not come off.
Yeah, great, thanks. We've got a few sort of slightly more practical questions that maybe James and I will just run through really quickly. Firstly, will the pitches be recorded for our own purposes to play back afterwards? That's from Alice. And at the moment, we are not planning to record the pitches, and in the past, they haven't been recorded. So I would say no, but if we do have a massive change of heart before the pitching day start, we would let you know in advance that we're going to film the pitches. Daniel asked, will the September masterclass on pitching be different to this one? And the answer to that is that one will be in person. That's on the 1st of September at Theatre at the Tabard in Chiswick in West London. And the format will likely be the same. We will have different panelists, so there will be different points of view, but a lot of the content covered will, I think, be the same. But if you have a really specific question about your own piece that doesn't get covered tonight, or you just want to ask something in person or talk to us in person, feel free to come along to that. We'd love to see you there, but the overall format and most of the content is likely to be similar. Would you agree, James? Yeah, cool. And a question from Karen, will we know who and how many people we will be pitching to in advance of the pitch? So yes, we will be sending you an email about 2 weeks before your pitch with all the details of how to get there and sort of a final confirmation. And that in that one, we will include who we think is going to be on the panel for your pitch. Of course, last minute availabilities, people might have new cancellations or emergencies. We can't guarantee that will be your panel, but we will try to give you an idea of who you will be pitching to. Great. Any other questions? Do you expect performers to be off book? That's from Alexander. Anyone have any thoughts on that one? Samir?
Yes, I made sure that all of my performers were off book. Personally, because that was my preference, I just wanted them to actually play and enjoy. But because there were also a bunch of friends who we got together and we performed and we rehearsed together, it was very easy to pick up the work and then they took the song away afterwards to practice on their own. So for me, it was just easier if they knew the songs by heart, because then they could actually just add their own performance elements to it. And engage with the audience. I think one of my boys started dancing in the middle of the pitch at the other palace, because he was just like got into groove.
Cool. Any other thoughts on off book, Matt?
Yeah, it should suit the show. So, as Samir describes, absolutely perfect, and you've got something extra to tell there. I think if it is about what is being said or sung and that suits your pitch, then actually standing at music stands with the words in front of you or the music in front of you and just delivering it as open as possible, that can be actually very, very effective as well for the right show. I think it's just wanting to ensure that the going back to I think Zara said at the beginning is just giving the best of your material in some way, so whichever works best. Just, for Samir mentioned the movement there. If movement is really integral to the piece, then you should, perhaps not having paper in hand and not having, then that makes absolute sense for that material. equally, if you want us to really listen to what's happening, then presenting it more formally is fine too.
And I'd just add, I think also on top of that, it's whatever your performers need to feel confident as well, because this might not be a cast you've been working with on this project for a long time. They might be doing you a favor, or you might have been able to pay them for half a day of their time, whatever, and you and they need to go in confident. And if that means either script in hand or on a music stand, better they do that and they're not worried about forgetting. And you've got that, then you sort of spend the whole time trying to learn it when you could be refining it and making that pitch as tight as possible.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. I think it's just about also your resources, and time's the most precious thing that anyone's got. So it isn't always possible. And as long as you feel you're as comfortable as you can be in what you're doing, then I think either's fine. I say it's I did do that for the showcase, but I don't think I would mind. I don't think I mind either way on the pitch, because it's how it has to be for you, I think.
Also, I read off my script to make sure I don't forget anything crucial, so I can't push others to do otherwise, can I?
I'd just say for those performers as well, we mentioned music stand kind of on purpose, so that you're not kind of either paper or iPad or iPhone in hand, because I don't know why, but it tends to be a bigger distance between the paper and the face, which takes the head further down. So the fact, if you've got a music stand, we tend to see more of the face. I'm assuming, sorry James and Natalia, I'm assuming that there are music stands, but the Lowry house, I can tell you that.
Yeah, picture the Lowry. Yeah. Just to clarify that point, yes, we usually, there'll be a music stand on the keyboard. There's always a keyboard in the room. For other music stands, sometimes it's just the music stand on the keyboard. We will try to have a music stand available more widely. What's bizarre with Beam is that we never know what's going to come through the door. Most pitches are 1 or 2 or 3 people, and then there's a chamber orchestra sometimes, or then there's a 20-piece choir. This does happen in Beam pitching days. So it's trying to guess how many music stands we need. We may not have 20. We won't have 20 music stands available, but we'll try and have 1 or 2 in addition to the keyboard if we can. But let us know. This is part of, do check in. If you have particular needs around your presentation, do get in touch with us in advance to see what's going to be in the room. If you need something further than just the keyboard, talk to us about your needs in advance, please.
Yeah, great. Okay, we've had a flurry more questions coming in. So let's maybe try and move through these fairly swiftly so we can get through as many as we can. So question from Hilmi. Is there anything a pitcher can do that would make the panel immediately go, this show isn't right for Beam? James, you've sat through a lot of these. Any thoughts on that?
Well, like Matt said, I think the immediate one, and this came up a lot in 2019 when we last did the pitching days before the pandemic postponed everything, and that is inauthenticity. Nowadays, it's one of the most frequent things that panelists discuss is, are those writing the show the right people to be telling this story? And if nowadays it feels like actually it's someone telling someone else's story without involving those whose story it is, that's an immediate no now. So it just feels like the time has gone for that feeling appropriate. So off the top of my head, that's the first one that comes to mind. I don't think there's anything else. We're very open-minded. There's no limits on, as long as there are characters singing, then we think it's a musical. So there's no limits on, saying, oh, that's not a musical. We're really open-minded. We want innovation. It's great. So I don't think there's anything else apart from, I guess, content that is inappropriate in some way. But I've never seen a pitch that we would immediately say no to, apart from afterwards saying, oh, we could not let that go through because it's inappropriate in terms of cultural sensitivity. So if it's an inauthentic, who's telling whose story, that would be the main reason. Great.
And a sort of follow-up question to that from Barbara is, historically, is there a specific type of show that tends to be chosen for the showcase? Which I think you pretty much answered in there, James, which is no, not really. And it's a deliberate aim of BEAM to showcase a really wide variety of work in terms of different styles of music, different backgrounds of the writers and the casts, and just we want to really see the diversity of this art form. And so I don't think there is a specific type of show. Another question from Alice: I'll be able to record our pitch. It might be useful to use for the feedback when we get it. And Emma is also asking, and if we are allowed to record our own pitches, would we be allowed to use it for a future pitch elsewhere? James, that might be another one for you, possibly. Oh.
Well, I was muted. I was reading a question from that's come through to me in the chat at the same time, so you have to repeat that. Many apologies.
Oh, sorry. Are pitchers allowed to record their pitches? And if they are, could they then use that recording to send a pitch to somebody else?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want, as Natalia was saying earlier, we don't plan to record pitches to us in terms of the industry panels at the pitching days, but you're welcome to bring in a phone or something, as long as it's really not going to interfere with the technical setup. I would say, you know, you don't want to bring a camera in and have any setup time, because that's just going to complicate things. Keep things really simple. If it's going to distract you in terms of the focus of your pitch, I would say really think, is this really necessary? Is it that much of a benefit? Because you really want to be focused on the panelists rather than on the camera. And if you've got multiple points of focus, if you're pitching to a camera and to the panelists, it might sort of dilute things slightly. So I think I've seen people recording on their phone just the audio, and I would say probably an audio recording is less distracting than trying to have a visual recording as well. So maybe that's a good compromise. And just to jump in, there's a question from someone watching to the panel, which is it acceptable for the pitch to be shared between a director and the writer-composer, so having multiple people pitching, or is this just complicating things and it's better if it's just the writer-composer that's delivering the whole pitch? What's your advice on a team pitch versus one person pitching the whole way through?
Steph, do you have thoughts on that, of sharing it amongst the team, because you've been involved?
Why not? Yeah, why not? I think we've both the ones I've done have been split amongst people. Apart from anything else, it just adds a bit of variety of voices. Not a problem if it's just you and your guitar, one voice, but there's from what I can see, there's no reason not to, as long as you've rehearsed it enough to know that you're going to do it to time. That's all that matters.
Great. And question from Alice: is it worth highlighting the current impact and engagement of the work, either on social media or with other creatives people? And so I think this was sort of linked to an earlier question about sort of, is current sort of social media following and engagement a consideration at all? Matt, would you have any thoughts on that?
You know, I don't know whether this relates to is you know, someone who's huge on YouTube going to be in it. I don't know if it's that rudimentary, but no is my answer. No, that's not. You know, it's the quality of the pitch and the idea of the project. It's meant to be open. It's meant to be equal as it possibly can be. Yeah, I don't think that's a factor. Was there another point in that question, Natalia? Sorry.
Well, it was worded slightly differently as an earlier question, which is, when evaluating new work, what impact does current social media or press releases have? If you already have a social media following, is this worth highlighting? I see. I suppose if the project is visible and out there and has been in some way, then, you know, there's no harm in kind of, you know, I suppose it's at least being upfront about what's happened with the piece so far. So it's more of a factual basis for the work, rather than trying to impress us with, you know, big figures. I don't know if anyone else thinks the same, or wherever. I've missed the point entirely.
That's great. And a question
sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's sort of just worth mentioning, you know, a lot of people, a huge percentage of people won't have got very far with what they're doing, because a lot of people will come in with sort of like, you know, ideas in really early stages of development, germination, you know, whatever. So I would think that more often than not there isn't of that stuff to sort of back up. It's not always true. There's examples of everything. So yeah, I agree with what Matt says, and I personally, I wouldn't have had those sorts of things to sort of take in. So I think, you know, whether you have or not, I wouldn't worry about it if you haven't. I wouldn't sort of think, well, that's the thing that's going to make a difference, because I don't think it will in the long run.
Question from Karen Bishko, which is to the panel: how would you feel about performers singing to backing tracks? Is backing tracks going to be a distraction, or is it a good thing? Does it work?
I've used backing tracks in my pitches. I think that it just depended entirely on the cost of, you know, did I have the musician, could I pay for the musicians to come in and present it? Or is my composer good enough to compose just entirely for a backing track? And for me, it was, I presented one with a band, I presented two without a band, entirely in backing track. So it's just all about, you know, what's right for you and what kind of energy you want to present. You know, if it's the big epic numbers with the Disney-esque soundscapes, go for the playback. You know, as long as it works for you.
Anything else to add from anyone? No, great. Yeah, again, it's what's most appropriate for the show, isn't it? A question from John: I'll be presenting on my own, so if I use your sound system, can I plug in my iPad from where I'll be giving the pitch? Yes, our aim is to have a simple PA type sound system in all of the pitching venues, with a basic aux cable to plug into an iPad or a phone. Or a laptop. I would say possibly if you've got some of the newer Apple technology that doesn't have the normal headphone jack type cable, it might be worth bringing an adapter, just in case the venue doesn't have that, because, you know, some of the newer phones don't have that traditional headphone cable. But yeah, we would aim to have a very simple plug-in system for most of your gadgets. And there was one from a while back from Tilly on thoughts on medleys in general. Steph, you mentioned, I think in one of the pitches you were involved with, there was a medley of songs. And is this generally a good way to go?
I mean, it worked for us. I mean, when I say medley, it's not like we ran them all back to back. We did it interspersed with bits of narrative, and we had some sort of underscoring playing during it. It worked. It just worked for us and what we needed to showcase. I think as long as it fits the time, why not? But I don't think you're under any pressure to.
Yeah, if you can, yeah, it depends how much material you have. You know, it really is your context, but a medley or a montage can be a very effective way to do it. But there are other ways too.
I just add to that, in some cases, I mean, I think it's very much going back to that point about the diversity of the score. Sometimes people share a medley of lots of songs that sound very similar to each other, and they just blur into each other a little bit, and they would have been much better served in that case by a single song where we get to really land and have a sense of what's going on. So it's thinking, what are you communicating by a medley? If it's a diversity of content, or if it's about the scope stylistically of the show, then that's really useful. But really think about the advantages or disadvantages compared to one song where we can really land with that song. And it's the same thing someone mentioned, might have been Steph again, talking about plot elements or story. And I think, again, it's thinking about the balance. Panelists' eyes glaze over, I find, if they're listening to 20 pitches in a day and people start talking in great detail about the plot step by step throughout a 3-act structure. Panelists can't absorb that much detail when they're listening to 20 plus pitches through a day. So it's about the overall concept of the story, the key themes, who is the protagonist, who's the character that is driving the story. That's something that we can connect to emotionally. But if you start talking about the meet cute and then what happens next, and then they meet their gran, and then their dog dies, and we just start to, it's too much information and it's not relevant enough for us to absorb in terms of what the audience experience. Like Matt was saying, we want to know what experience will the audience have overall. Is it going to be a great night out? Is it going to be a transformative, provocative, life-changing experience that they'll be aghast, but they'll be transformed for the better by it. It's sharing what that experience will be.
Great. And James, Could you tell us a little bit about the eligibility requirements for BEAM? Because we try and be as open access as possible, but there is a little bit of an application procedure. Could you talk about that?
Yes, so we say that BEAM the pitching days are aiming to be one of the most accessible entry points into the industry. So we try to have a very low benchmark for coming along to pitch for BEAM. In the past, we've sometimes found that if people have never, absolutely it can be your first musical ever. You don't have to have any past credits of having written a musical before. But we do ask that people over the age of 25 have some kind of creative credit. It could be being an architect or an artist, but a visual artist, but some professional credit in a creative area. It might be performing art, it might not be, but we do ask for some professional credit. If you're aged between 18 and 25, we've now got a new ruling that says, because we want more applications more pitches from young people, and we know that some people between the age of 18 and 25 may not yet have had an opportunity post-education to have gathered some professional credit. So in those cases, if you're under 25, we will take into account student productions, equivalent experiences outside of higher education. If you can talk about some creative experiences you've had that are equivalent to just showing your commitment to wanting to work in the arts, then tell us about those instead, and we'll consider those instead. The other eligibility criteria, we have very few. The only other one really is about intellectual property. Like we said earlier, that we want you to have the intellectual ownership of what you're pitching to us, just because we don't think it's fair to share a show with people that may get into problems further on the lines because actually the rights are owned by someone else who's not fully involved in the project. So we ask that ideally the project is coming from the minds of the creatives who are actively involved, or if you do have any content that is copyright and owned by people that aren't actively involved in the project, you must be able to give us some kind of evidence that you've cleared the rights, you've managed to get permission to fully use that other person's copyright material in your show. Yeah.
I would just add to that, I think our final eligibility requirement, which is that at least half of the writing team are resident in the UK. So just to outline the application procedure, if you're not already aware, all of our pitching days are open to apply for now at beamshowcase.com. You can see the list of where we'll be and on what date. You click on your preferred venue and date, and you're taken through to a system where you can pick your slot, a half-hour slot. You'll see which ones are still available. And then there's a simple form which asks about your project, asks about you and what you've done, any collaborators you're working with, and if you have the intellectual rights to it. So you submit that to us. We check over that, see if we think your project and you are eligible, and then you'll get a confirmation email from us giving you your specific time within the half-hour slot that you specified. And then, as I said before, about 2 weeks before the actual pitching day, you'll get another email from us just confirming all the details of that day. Right, we have some more questions coming in. Okay. If the work is related to a social movement, how much time should be spent outlining this cause? And where there is historical involvement, how much detail would you suggest? Anyone? Thoughts?
I think I just go back to what we've all sort of answered, is going back to the how much of your 10-minute slot do you want to spend on your song, and how much do you want to spend on your narrative? Personally, for me, it's the material that we all want to hear, and that's what we want to see and engage with. So I'd bulk that at maybe 2/3, and then 1/3 at the talking and the pitching of it. As a ratio. I mean, that's what I feel works for me. Obviously, other producers might be different, but it's also about the work. What is the work?
Any other thoughts on how much time relating to the cause of the social movement, the historical context, rather than the material itself?
I would just enough so that they understand where you're situating it. That's probably, you don't need to get into the detail, and unless it's so complicated, in which case you might need to work on your elevator pitch before you come. But if your material isn't giving a sense of it, and if you need to have really in-depth knowledge of it in order to showcase it, that's going to be difficult for any audience, let alone a kind of a 10-minute pitching panel. So maybe just enough to situate it and assume they'll pick it up as they go along, but I don't know.
Yeah, the inference behind the question is that, you know, for this piece, or that it's important and it's something you're passionate about, and you absolutely, you know, tell us that. But if it is something you're really passionate about, then there's a chance you're going to keep talking about it. So you're going to have to be really strict with yourself. So it's expressing that passion and where it's rooted and why it's rooted and why it's important, but do it in 30 seconds. And as everyone said something, and Steph said, it kind of, then it's the time to move on to the other bits.
Yeah, great.
Question here from Tim, and that is to the panel: would you consider a show inauthentic if the writers don't have lived experience of the world of the musical? I.e., the example is the musical is set in a historic European conflict, and obviously the writer hasn't lived through that historic European content. So I guess we're talking about what's the line here, and without another 90-minute conversation, it's a difficult one, we know. Is there a line between what counts as legitimate subject matter using your imagination versus if it's historically based? What would you say?
I mean, I am writing a piece set in the 70s. I was born late 70s. I don't have collective memory of that time period, but what I've written about is people of that particular era. They have a specific set of emotions. Those emotions are universal. It's like the way Shakespeare is written for every time, every age. You know, that's essentially what you're writing for. What makes your characters empathetic? What makes your characters worth believing and fighting for, us engaged with? Those are the most important things that I feel are more important to get right. So that's kind of where that's my stance on it.
I guess it's about sort of the themes of the show and the thrust of what you're exploring. I'm trying to think, I'm going to end up coming up with a really crass example, so I apologize. But if, for example, you're writing a show about World War II and you're looking at the experience of the Jewish community during that, and you do not have Jewish heritage, it doesn't matter that you weren't alive during World War II. You perhaps need to think about whether you're the right person to tell that story. So I think perhaps look at it from that angle. Nobody was alive 200 years ago. We're not going to stop writing stories about 200 years ago, but we just need to think of what the themes are and whose stories within that historical context we're telling, and then interrogate who on the team is helping us to bring maybe a contemporary lived experience to that.
Great. Another question from Karen. But is it in the pitch, is it relevant to mention what you've worked on previously, or is that just irrelevant in the pitch? James, do you want to take this one?
Matt, have you got ideas?
Yeah, you know, a bit of background about yourself is useful. But again, not something to really focus on for a long time.
Yeah, and because we will have had the application form from you, which will briefly detail your previous experience, and we will likely have a copy of that with us on the day, so we can remind ourselves of who you are and what you've done. Yes, I would say it's not something to spend a lot of time on, considering the short pitches are so short.
Yeah, and like people have mentioned earlier, it's funny. Pitching a show is often a vehicle for pitching you as an artist. It's one specific example of a creative vision, and often what happens from BEAM is that people might not pick up that specific show, but through experiencing the pitch, they go, I'm really interested in the way that those artists think. So it is about that being a vehicle by which we can have an introduction to you as an artist, or you as a team of creatives, and the way your creative imaginations work. So yeah, I think it's keeping that in mind as well. we're now out of time. So before we sign off, our lovely membership manager, Kate, in the background of this call, keeps reminding me that we absolutely need to remind you that you don't need to be a member of MMD as in a writer or composer, or of MTN as in a director, a producer, higher education coordinator, or a venue representative to be an MTN member. But we always love people to join us as members. And the way you can do so is through the MMD or the MTN websites that have membership sign up pages. If you are a member of MMD or MTN, you get fortnightly email communication about what all the members are doing and about what's going on in new musical theatre. It's a way of staying in the loop, being the first to hear about opportunities like pitching to BEAM, signing up for development opportunities, labs, masterclasses, etc. But it's also a way of being a part of these communications, part of these conversations, being first to be a part of those. We'll very soon be announcing some more member events, including further Creative Consciously events about inclusivity, and also our first environmental sustainability and musical theatre roundtable that will be happening next month. So announcements soon to come. Thank you so much for joining us today. Anything further from you, Natalia?
No, just a big thank you to all our panelists for joining us today, and thank you to everybody watching and for your questions. And we really hope to see you at Pitching Day in the autumn. Bye.